Sweet. How you doing, man? How's it going,
Not bad. Not bad.
Okay, good. All right. Well, let's. It is 3 minutes after, almost 4 minutes after. Let's get this thing going. Everybody, welcome to the this SSG July webinar. We are excited to be talking to you and presenting this topic, and we have the awesome pleasure of having the world famous Steve Jones kind of with us today to talk. He's going to be talking about, actually, well, I'll be talking about kind of SQL DevOps, and that's kind of a topic that SSG is kind of getting into a little bit. And so let's first get started. Steve, why don't you take a second and introduce yourself, and then let's just kick this thing off.
Sure. So I'm Steve Jones, and I've been working with SQL Server for over 30 years now, which is kind of crazy to think about. But the vast majority of my life has been spent as a DBA or developer, software, or a manager of those teams. And in my career, I've worked for a variety of big and small companies in different industries. And so I've had different experiences of how we build software well or how we do it poorly, and then how we operate it as well. Right. I do work Redgate Software right now. I am an advocate there, which means I talk to a lot of people. I do things like this. I get to talk to Scott, and I haven't seen Scott in a while, but normally I see Scott at some event somewhere in the world. Right. Some different things.
Yeah.
I also founded SQL Server Central about 21 years ago now.
Dang, has it been that long?
Yeah, it's been that long.
Wow.
So I had a few business partners there, and we started this site to try to help you be better at your job. That was the goal for people with SQL Server and databases, and that grew, and now Redgate continues to support me running that site. And then I guess maybe the last thing, I run SQL Saturday as well. Like when Pass failed, I got that brand donated to an independent nonprofit, and so we have a U.S. charity that runs kind of SQL Saturday and tries to coordinate events. And so we've had a few this year. Hopefully we'll have a few more here in the future.
Nice. Awesome. I love SQL Saturdays. We definitely need more of those. So, if you need some help, let me know, because I'd love to, we need to get these things going again.
Yeah,
all
absolutely.
Right. So let's kick this thing off. And today's topic is SQL DevOps. And I don't know how DevOps has been around for, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, quite a while. But from the database perspective, I think I don't know. I don't know how long it's kind of been a thing, but it's been I think it's becoming more of a need. And let's just kind of kick it off and like, what is DevOps, and what is SQL Server, or what is SQL DevOps, and kind of why? Oh, and let me back up and say, anybody that's listening, look, this is an open forum. If you have questions, type it in the chat, because this is not we're not gonna, there's no slides. This is just informal, chat with Steve and I and you. And so if you have questions, and put those in chat, and we're happy to answer those. So let's kind of back the bus up and go, what is DevOps? And as a database, as a DBA, kind of why should I, and what is it at a high level? And let's just kind of start there and, dig deeper then.
Sure. So, I guess DevOps is kind of a name or a moniker we've given to some good software practices, right? So Scott, you and I have been programming a long time, writing code since we were kids. And for most of us, we were told all these things we should be doing to write good code, right? We document stuff, we plan it out, we do all this stuff. And we got to industry, most of us realized we don't do any of that stuff, right? We take shortcuts. I remember back in the early days of SQL Server, we had name pipes and things for connectivity. And so we had all these shortcuts that let you kind of get stuff done. And what DevOps tried to do is say, let's bring back some good practices, but in a lightweight way, right? So we don't want to do the old waterfall method of stuff. Instead, what we really want to do is recognize that our whole goal in software is to get a feature to a customer of some sort, right? Yeah. We're trying to get it where something can use, and we want it at a high quality, and we want to get better over time with this stuff. And so DevOps is really about flow, which is trying to get those features from the development side to the production side. It's feedback so that we understand if they're working, did they deploy correctly, do they meet the needs of the customer, all that kind of stuff. And then it's learning and experimentation. So I'm sure we've all heard we want to fail fast and fail small if we do something wrong. And that's kind of the goal here, is that we want to try new things as we build software. And if they work, we want to make sure everybody adopts them, right? So, like we have error handling in SQL, or we have error handling in .NET. We want to make sure that when we find a pattern that works for us, let's have everybody adopt it. And then if we find things that don't work well, let's stop doing them, right? And that's kind of the idea of DevOps, is that we're just trying to get stuff to the customer as quickly as possible, but we're also improving quality, and we're ensuring that we are following our best practices over time, whatever they are. Okay. Yeah. And then in the SQL world, I think what we're trying to do is adopt some of those ideas and treat our database code like application code, which is not something most of us have done, right? Normally we talk to a DBA somewhere, and they bless our changes, and then they deploy them. And, right. They check everything we do, and and in general, a lot of that stuff works, but occasionally we make mistakes, or we forget to do something, right? One of the things I've done often, I'm sure you have, Scott, is that we get this thing, we deploy it to a QA or test server, and we realize it doesn't work. So we fix it, right? We go into QA and we fix it, and then we go to deploy something to production, and we forgot to fix our fix. So we have to fix it again in production, right? And the SQL DevOps, the database DevOps, is trying to validate that the code works, and then make sure that we release it to QA and to production and to everywhere else the same way, so that we just have kind of a repeatable, reliable process.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now, is this I'm trying to figure out how to ask this, because as a DBA, is this kind of a new paradigm? Is this a paradigm shift for DBAs? Because like you say, we're trying to I'm just going to code this and throw it into test, right, and something like that. And how do we, as a DBA, how do we think about that and get people to stop? Like, we got a couple customers that are coding right to production, right? And it's like, oh my goodness, they're like, and that's why they brought us in to go, hey, help us implement some source control, DevOps pipeline stuff, right? Is this kind of is this kind of a paradigm shift for DBAs, and how do we get them to think about this in terms of, hey, we more of a developer mindset? Is this more getting them to think more of a developer mindset type of thing?
It's a little bit of that, right? Like, I think for DBAs, it's all about control, right? We hate to be on call. We hate to be called because things don't work well. We hate working at midnight to deploy code. We hate all that stuff. But at the same time, we're trying to be super careful, right? Because if the data in production really matters, right? It's super important to our customers. And if something breaks that, we get in trouble. Developers get yelled at. The company, everybody is in trouble when the database goes down.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so a lot of the things for DBAs is that I don't trust the developers, right? I don't trust the mindset, and I don't trust the system to do it correctly. But we as DBAs make plenty of mistakes, right? I mean, how many of us have connected to the wrong database and then deployed code, right? We think we're connected to production, and we're not, or we think we're connected to test and we're not. We have forgotten to run a script, or all of us have probably highlighted code in Management Studio and run it, realize that we forgot to highlight that last line in the where clause, or the order by, or something else, right? And so trying to get them to understand that DevOps isn't anything you wouldn't do manually. All we're trying to do is just put a little bit of lightweight process around it so that it's repeatable and reliable.
Yeah, trying to automate it, right?
Trying to automate it, because we as humans, we're just not repeatable and reliable. Like right now, for me, Wednesday, it's noon on Wednesday, right, Scott? I'm probably pretty reliable right now. But 4:50 on Friday night, I'm probably not super reliable, right? Because I'm trying to get out of here. I'm trying to do something else. I'll shortcut something. We're in a hurry. Really trying to get DBAs to just remember that they define the process. So DevOps doesn't say you should do A, B, and C. It just says you define the process. We're going to automate what you do manually, and we're going to ensure that it happens repeatable, reliable.
So what are those? What are the things then we have to, as a DBA, we have to think about? What are those processes? What are those steps, right? Because we're going in, and some of these things I'm learning going in, because I'm not some of this is a little bit new to me, right? So this is, and you and I have had several conversations going, hey, help me understand this, right? And so it's been a God, having you to go, hey, put me in the right direction has been, phenomenal. So what are these? What are the things that we as DBAs have to think about if we're going to go? How do we get started? And what are the steps and processes to go? How do I not mess this up?
Right.
And because it's not because I don't see this. This is not a overnight thing, right? So how do I?
No, I mean, there's tooling always helps, right? So tooling matters, whether that is something you create or something you buy, right? Like Redgate, we sell that software, but Microsoft has some, you can write your own, all that stuff. The thing is, and this is where I struggle with a lot of customers talking about, is that we always demo, right? We talk about what do I do in development, right? What do I do in test? And then how do I get that to production?
Yeah.
But the hardest part sometimes when I talk to them is that you have to think about how I get to production first, because that's what I really care about, right? That I need to deploy code to production. And so the idea really is that I want to think about, in what way do we deploy to production in my environment? So in a lot of places I've worked, right, from my desktop, I can connect to production, right? That's fine. Some customers I work with, that's not allowed, right? There's a firewall break there, so stuff has to cross into a DMZ where it would be executed in a DMZ. So maybe I have a jump server or remote desktop server. And then I have customers that, deployed it to other branch offices or their customers, so they can't even see production, right? They just have to send something along. And so understanding how you go to production is usually the way to start. And then you go, okay, now I know how I get to production. How do I get that package or that script or that thing I need? How do I build that? Right, because
is that a challenge you have? And I apologize for interrupting. Is that a mind shift for when you talk to people? As as a developer, I'm thinking here, but now you're asking people to go think about deploying to production, right?
It is a little bit. I mean, so at Redgate, if we sell you tool set, we've thought about how to get to production, right? So we know how to produce that package.
Okay.
So we know how to generate that package. So we know how to store that in version control. And so that changes the process. But when I try to get people to think about it when they want to adopt it, right, as I said, this isn't a long project, right? But if you said today, how do I deploy to production? Well, I get a script, we connect in Management Studio, and we run it, okay? So you go, okay, so you need a script and you need a way to run it. And in an automated fashion, we don't use Management Studio, right? We would use SQL command or something else. Right. So we go, okay, you need a script. Okay, how do you get that script built? So now we step back and go, how do we build that script? Well, people email it to me and I look at it. Okay, great. We can certainly have somebody always put stuff into a share. Maybe we have a folder for each release, right? So we say, here's the July release, here's the August release, whatever. So you go, okay, so that's a way to think about it. Now, how do I get people to get that stuff in there? Well, they write the code and they save it. Okay, but can they just change it at any point in time? Do we want to make sure that somebody else looks at that code before it gets deployed, right? Because one of the challenges is if I have code on a share or I email it, potentially somebody else could approve it and look at it, and then I could change that code, which is something that causes us no shortage of problems in the world, right? That
right, yeah.
I change something in production or we change something in flight. So then you say, okay, what you really want to do is have people check it in the version control, and then you say, we're going to take this particular version so that we know that this code is what we're going to test in QA, or we're going to test, in training or staging or beta or whatever. Right. And then we're going to take that same file because it comes from version control and we'll deploy it to production. So part of it is just a really quick way of saying, how do I get there? And then you go, okay, now think about from the tooling perspective, how do I get that stuff into version control? How do I pull it out and put it in a place that I can test it, right? Put it on a different database. Yeah. All those things, right? And most of us, if we had to do this manually, it would really take us about this long, 10 minutes to go, here's the process, right? The problem is if we trust every junior developer, right? Or everybody we hire, or us Friday night
Right.
We will make mistakes. So then we go, okay, how do we automate this stuff?
Right. Okay.
And that's really how I did it. I mean, Scott, you know, in 1999, I worked at a small startup company, and I got tired of showing at the office at night to deploy code. So we put all the code in version control right next to the application code, right? And this was, we had Cold Fusion developers, right? If you remember that thing, they were running all this web code.
Yeah.
And I had all this database code that would get from developers. We would stick it in version control, and then we would branch it and say, all right, this is the release. This is the release for this week. And then I literally had VB script to go grab all that code out of there and order it. So we said, you know, tables will be in their own folder, stored procedures in their own folder. And we would order the code because, right, I run tables first, then I run views, then I run stored procedures. So we just had a really simple VB script to say, pull all this stuff together, get it ordered, and then call SQL command and execute it. Or I think ISQL at that point. But right, that was kind of the basics of what we would do today in DevOps. And so rather than me assembling stuff, right, we would get it into version control, developers are in control. And then as a DBA, I would run one script command that would pull all this code and send it to QA. And we would test it. And if it worked, we already had the whole package downloaded. We would just say, run this on production, right? And if it didn't, we would update version control, right? Developers would fix their code, and we would just repeat the process. I'd grab that script and run it again, and it would update QA again.
Right.
Right. And so it's not a complex thing, but you have to spend literally, you know, 30 minutes thinking about it, discussing it with the team, and then going, how do we implement this stuff? And that's really, it could be that simple. Now, if you have one application, a very controlled environment, it really is that simple, right? It's probably a couple hours of scripting for most of us. But when you have multiple environments, and I've got, you know,
I was just going to ask that is, you know, because we can say, I think all day long, it could be this simple, but what are the things that make it not simple? Like, what are the challenges that we run into, or what are the hiccups or the environmental things that make it not simple? Does that make sense?
Yep. I mean, I think the biggest thing that makes it not simple is that most of our development tools as SQL people or data people are very immature, right? Like, they're just incredibly immature in terms of modern software. So like Management Studio doesn't integrate well with version control. Even the tools that integrate with version control don't do a good job of putting that code into some ordered structure, right? Which is a problem, right? We don't have a compiler, right? We have to run SQL Server or Oracle or MySQL to compile code, and then we don't get a result, right? Like, it lives on the platform. We don't get a DLL that we can copy to another machine and say, run this, right? So the immaturity of our stuff is hard. And then that puts this huge burden on people, right? And like, if I tell you, Scott, save all stored procedures in this folder, and you have to name them, you know, dba.name, or just name them the stored procedure name, but put them in a DBO folder, how many times are you going to screw that up in a week, right? Like, I mean, I've done it for years and I still mess it up. So without tooling, that's really the hard part. And then getting the humans to trust the process is what takes time.
From a DBA perspective, do you find that a challenge? Because, you know, right? Because they're like, no, I got it, right? I can do this, right? But then I think one of the biggest, right, not to knock anybody that's, watching this webinar, but is that kind of one of your biggest challenges, is going, getting them to understand and trust the process?
Yeah, getting them to understand they really haven't lost control. What we've done is just take out some of the manual stuff they do, right? Like, I know DBAs that would still go in and manually delete old error log files in SQL Server because they wouldn't trust a script to not delete something they needed, right? Even though you could say anything over 30 days old, right, that hasn't been written to, we should just delete, right? We know we have a backup somewhere, but getting them to just trust that you still can see everything that's going on, because any of the DevOps flows I've seen, right, with whatever tool set you use, there's a ton of logging and information there. So we can always tell what's going on. And for all these automated tools, we can always put gates in place, meaning that somebody gets an email, somebody has to go click a button and approve it. Somebody can actually see the script that's running. and they can make a decision, do I let it go or not let it go, right? Which
Yeah.
to me is huge, right? Trying to get to understand that when I go to Management Studio and run something, I can't tell you how many times I've had 4 things on the screen and I can't remember if I ran number 3 or not. Right?
Yeah, right.
Right? Because especially when you're troubleshooting, you're in a crisis, sometimes it says, right, this command ran successfully, and you're like, well, heck, what command just ran? Right. And the good thing about running all this thing through some sort of DevOps pipeline is that there's a log that says this ran, and you can go say, okay, now I know what ran. What does that script do? Why did it break, everything, right?
Yeah, it's a trust hoarder where DBAs are tech hoarders, right?
They are.
Trust issue.
And it's not just DBAs. I mean, if you remember, right, if you think back, Scott, in the early days of like Windows 3.1, Windows 95, right? Like trying to run through an installer and set that up as a software developer, sometimes you're like, I don't know that it's going to put everything I need it, right? I mean, how many of us wrote our own scripts to say, make sure this image file gets copied here or this DLL gets put here, because we didn't trust tools to move software appropriately.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah. So how do we overcome that tooling, like you call it, this tooling shortcoming, right? What's the? I
mean, I hate to say it, right?
That's probably a loaded question, right?
Yeah. I mean, I worked for Redgate, right? So just disclosure, right? Like I have a vested interest in people buying database software tooling, whether you buy Redgate or you bought somebody else's. I think that there has to be some sort of tooling in place, and whether or not you want to buy something, you want to use something open source, or you want to build something, we got to get people to just kind of standardize and agree that I need something to help me, right? Because most of the vendors just haven't done a good job of helping us the way that they've helped software developers, right? And I think a lot of that is because the platforms don't support loading code easily, right? Like for a Windows app, I know I can get an exe, some resource files, a DLL and stuff, and I can move that and that easy, right? For a mobile app, similar things, right? Like I might have a bunch of jar files and things that copy down, but there's ways to do that. In a database platform, it's like this magic box every time, right? We send it to QA, and then we've kind of lost control of it, right? All we have is the source code again that we have to send somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so, trying to get them to understand that paradigm, is broken, right? Right. I don't anticipate, Microsoft giving us a folder on SQL Server where we drop stored procedure code anytime soon, or Oracle or anybody else. So a lot of it is just going, you really need to adopt tooling, right? And that means you have to spend a little bit of time evaluating, Microsoft, Redgate, somebody else, and going, what do I think? And then piloting it and then going with it, right? Because fundamentally, at a high level, the way that Redgate works versus Microsoft tooling versus somebody else is really the same, right? But
under the covers, you're saying, right?
Well, just the high level process, right? That we're capturing code and storing it, right? We do this. What people get hung up with is that the format is different or the syntax is different, but really that's a minor thing, right? I think, if I left Redgate and went somewhere else, or I went to Microsoft and they said, you got to adopt SSDT and SQL package, I don't really care, right? Like they both work well. They both have holes. They both have advantages. We just adjust what we're doing and adopt it. But trying to get everybody to adopt something is hard. And, Redgate included, right? A lot of the vendors charge a lot of money for this stuff because it is valuable for you as a database person.
So in your opinion, and I hope this is probably another loaded question, but in your opinion, what is it? Because DevOps, SQL DevOps has been around for a long time, and SQL DevOps, has been around for a little while. Right. Why in your opinion, why isn't the tooling catching up? And I'm not trying to point at Redgate or anything like that. I mean, because I'm sure they're all, but that's a valid question, right? Why is there still a?
I mean, I think A, it's hard. B, there isn't a standard way of doing it, right? Like if you think back to early network monitoring stuff, what what happened is everybody kind of proprietary kind of did stuff in their own way, right? And at some point we started to have, some standard network monitoring with traps and things, but still everybody did their own way. And that's where we are now, is I think industry-wise, we're a little bit immature in terms of saying, how do we want to adopt this stuff? And then the other part is there's a lot of fear. So if you look at,
it's that trust thing, right? Is it still that trust thing, or
it's more the fear thing that there's, developers are lazy, right? Like, I've been a software developer. We're lazy. Okay. Making database changes is hard, right? Because I have to maintain state, right? Like I can't drop a table. I have to keep it and evolve it. And so as I've talked to people in the DevOps world, right, that build software, mostly they try to ignore the database as much as possible. Right? They really try hard to treat it as, a dumb store and not put logic in it, or want to have to deal with any structural changes. But that's short-sighted, right? Because A, relational databases aren't going anywhere. And B, if you move to a NoSQL store, the complexities live in software then, not in the database, but they still are there, right? And all these state of DevOps people, the Spotifys, the Googles, so many of those companies try desperately to avoid working with the database and incorporate it in their system because it's hard, right? It's slow. I can't roll back easily, right? There's all these challenges just because the database has state. And I think honestly, when I check at the companies that have done it really well, it's the Googles and the Microsofts, the huge companies that can basically just say, this thing has to run 24/7, an outage is unacceptable. And so you have to be able to upgrade and downgrade. And so they've forced those developers at Google and Microsoft to just go, we have to embrace this. Right. So the Azure DevOps, ladies and gents, they know how to make database changes live. They use feature flags extensively. They know how to roll back. The Google people that are doing Gmail and other apps, they're the same way. But a lot of us just haven't been forced to adopt those practices, right? Because the DBAs work extra hours, or there's nobody that requires dev and ops to work together. It has to be smooth.
So let's back up on the adoption thing. Is it like we were talking fears? I think is it one, it's hard, and two, is the fear factor in there because it's hard? Is there the fear factor in there that, oh my goodness, I might mess this up?
Yeah, that's the big area. I think the biggest areas that we see when we've commissioned surveys, right, to do reports and stuff, those are up near the top. The other one is time. Like I still got to deliver work now. So you're asking me to deliver work now plus figure out this other thing. And so resource constraints are a challenge, right? And so normally if I get a customer to say, I'm going to adopt Redgate tooling, right? Because we kind of have an end-to-end flow. What we normally start doing is going, listen, we're going to do this in a small area where we're just going to capture code. Your DBAs will still pull that code and do their deployment however they want to do it, right? And then what we'll start to do is we'll start to add CI, right? Some validation. We'll start to add some things over time, and then we'll get to the deployment later. But we do it across time because I still have work to get done. Right. And I can't interrupt everything. So the time constraint is big too. And then the last one is a lot of people feel they don't have the skills to do this stuff. Like they see Azure DevOps and they get intimidated. And I understand, right? If you go to Azure DevOps, there's a million things on the screen, right? And they move, right? Like every quarter they move. And so it's maddening, right? Like, but most of you, like, these are fairly simple concepts, and the stuff on Azure DevOps is like, it's like the stuff when Windows upgrades, right? And they move the start menu from left to right or something. It's really minor stuff, right? I realize it's annoying, but most everybody is still skilled enough to do this stuff, right? If you know how to write scripts, you're fine.
Okay. You're fine. So let's back up again, talk processes again, and I think and you mentioned this just a minute ago. One of the things that you mentioned was CI, right? And so what is, let's kind of define what CI, because there's the whole CI/CD, right? Continuous integration, continuous development. Explain what that is and how this plays a role in all of this, right? And kind of, and I guess, and along with that, how does this help smooth the,
Sure.
the learning curve, right?
So the TLDR thing, quick, is that CI is independent validation and verification. And what that really means is that we no longer accept it works on my machine as an excuse, right? Yeah. We say it has to work on another machine. So that's really what it is. The very quick history is that if you've ever read the Mythical Man Month, which I recommend, we learn that any number of developers across any point in time that work independently will never get their code to work together, right? Like it's a nightmare, right? So we have to we have to check the teamwork constantly. And Microsoft started this, in the 80s with their daily builds, right? Where they said, all right, whatever code Scott you wrote today, whatever code I wrote, we're going to compile it together today at 4 o'clock. And if it doesn't work, nobody goes home, right? We fix it because there's only so much damage we can do in a day.
Yeah.
As we've gotten better hardware, we've now taken that with continuous integration, right? Rather than daily integration, we just go now, every time that you commit code, meaning that you put your name on it and said, I think this works, we're going to run it with everybody else's code and we're going to make sure it still works.
Yep.
And so in the database world, that means that, we want to now rebuild your code with somebody else's to make sure that you haven't caused a deferred name resolution issue, you haven't removed a column that some other query needs, that you and somebody else didn't add conflicting changes. We're trying to just independently validate that this code will work somewhere else, right? And for Redgate, it's a two-step process. One is we build all your code from scratch in a database, right? So a blank database, we build everything because I got to tell you, 80% of my customers have broken databases in production. Like they've got code that just won't run, but they just don't run it anymore, so they don't realize it's broken, right? They've dropped a column, they've renamed something, they have code that doesn't run. So we validate your entire code base just to make sure it works. And then for us, we would also take the differential between that and the last development database or a copy of production and go, can we actually upgrade this database with new code? So we make sure that you haven't broken anything in the way, right? That stuff works. And so the idea is that you can add testing to this, you can do whatever checks you want, but let's have an automated check of our code to A, make sure it compiles, right? That I can execute it, and B, that anything I want to evaluate still works, right? So if I want to check that a function or store procedure still produces results, I can do that. If I want to, check that there's an index on a column, it's there. Or if I want to check that I have primary keys or that, I've named things appropriately, I can check all those things. If I want to make sure you're not using no lock, I can run scans to go, is there a no lock in this new code? Right?
Oh, nice.
And so it's all about just kind of a quick automated check before a human in QA or an application gets to the code.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to throw a wrench in all of this and go, all right, because how does the cloud figure into all of this, right? Because there's Azure DevOps.
Yep.
But how, and that, I think that goes a long way to kind of some of this. But what challenges do I? And speaking of, you and I just had a couple conversations about this, right? How does the cloud play into this, and what challenges can I expect when trying to do DevOps in whether it's Azure or AWS or Google or whatever?
Yep. So from the dev perspective, right, the cloud is fantastic, right? Because most of us have learned to work remotely and stuff, and we have to share code. And there's a lot of tooling in the cloud to help me mess around with code, right? Do builds, do releases, do all that stuff. So there it helps. But if you're doing production cloud databases, right? So whether that's a PaaS thing like Azure SQL Database, or Aurora or BigQuery, Spanner, whatever you're doing there.
Right.
The challenge is often having a development environment that matches that, right? Because we don't get Azure SQL Database on premise, right?
Right.
So there's a challenge there.
Right.
As
much as many times as we've asked.
Many times we asked, right? And SQL Server is close, but it's not there.
Right.
Same thing if you do, some of the Amazon products, right, they're built on MySQL or Postgres, but they're not quite the same.
Right.
So
Yep.
the challenges often are, A, getting a development copy up there, B, costs, right, because the more developers I have, the more challenges I have if we share a database, the more costs I have if everybody gets their own one. How do I spin them up, spin them down, right, track all that resource stuff? That's a challenge.
Yeah.
And then the way that we connect things together in the cloud sometimes is different. And so we have to, in some sense, be better software developers, how we talk with the application, how naming works, right? Because in general, we can often just go, let's connect to localhost, or we have a config item here. But in the cloud, everything's a URL. There's firewalls, there's connectivity and networking challenges that we have to put in place. And not only that, we have to migrate those changes, right? So if I have a linked server, or if I have a connection from an application and I go from, scottdev.database.windows.net, and I need to go to production SQL.database.windows, I gotta have to make sure I have a way to adjust that stuff in code, right? Because somewhere there's a secret, a connection string, something, and even if I have different ones for dev and prod, either I have different complete secret stores, which means that I know to connect to a different store, right? Or there's still a different name in any sort of thing I have. So those environmental issues are always challenging. To be fair, some of those exist on premises as well, but the cloud puts them right in your face, right? You can't get away from those things, right? No more local host on stuff you do.
Right. Yeah, and that's been, like I said, I've had a couple conversations around this, and it's been a challenge, right?
Yeah.
From a naming perspective and things like that. But and again, from a tooling perspective, right? I think there's I think lack of tooling capabilities makes this a little harder too, right? When you're dealing with cloud stuff, not to pile on or anything like that, but I think there's a,
it's an issue.
Yeah. Do you see more and more, like in your experience with everybody you work with, do you see more and more people doing cloud type of, or needing DevOps in the cloud, or using the cloud and needing DevOps, or is it kind of you still see primarily on-prem?
No, I mean, we see a lot of both, but definitely there's a lot more interest in the cloud. Like we see, especially in larger organizations, more and more, they don't want to have to worry about maintaining infrastructure at all, right? They definitely want to make sure that they don't have anything critical on a particular person's laptop. Like that stuff is always pushing out somewhere else.
Right.
So we see a lot more cloud all the time. Not to say that we don't see plenty of on-premises stuff or a VM in the cloud, which doesn't really feel like cloud, in some way, but it you still have some of that networking naming challenges there. The network resolution stuff is always a challenge, but people love the cloud. I mean, it's stunning to me to think back, right? That what was it, 2005 or 6 that we got like the first Azure table storage.
Yeah.
In Windows Azure at that time, like you got a key value table you could use, to now, I mean, most people we have are always thinking cloud first. They may not go there, but they are always thinking, should we just put this in a VM?
Yeah,
or
it's at least in the back of their mind, right?
They are
an option now, right?
Yeah, unless you're a company that still just owns a lot of stuff and you're like, we're afraid.
Right.
Most customers are looking cloud.
Okay.
Which is crazy, right? Like, I mean, from 2015 to now, I'm stunned at the growth in Azure and AWS and GCP, right? It's incredible.
Huge. Yeah. Let's go back to your 4 points really quick. The things that you were talking about, are your 4 items. How do we help people overcome that? Those points. And I'll be honest, I don't remember all 4.
Yeah. No, that's
right.
fine.
But there was just the fear. There was, oh my goodness, this is a test. This test that I'm failing, right? But how do we get them down? How do we help people overcome those 4 topics?
So the fear thing, I usually, if we're engaged and we're talking about stuff, what I usually try to get them to do is say, look, you need a sandbox, right? And really what that means is you need to create a database with one table in it, right, with one column. And then you need to go, if I create a database on test, how do I get that there without a human doing the work?
Yeah.
Right? So meaning that I got to get that code into a source control system and I got to pull it out and execute it on QA. And then you got to do the same thing on production.
Yeah.
And what I really try to get them to do is you need that sandbox always, because if you adopt some crazy new feature, right? Like I see this all the time. People go, we want to adopt partitioning or we want to adopt synonyms. I'm like, you do not want to do that in your production database to practice because you'll screw it up. Right. So keep that sandbox around, like literally go on production and make a database that's empty, go on QA and make a database that's empty, and then go, okay, if I can't do this with a manual human in a way, how do I get that code to move? Right. And so doing it somewhere small like that, and you go, listen, take 15 minutes a day to do this, not this whole project, but outside of your work, solve this problem, right? Whether it's with Redgate tools or Microsoft tools or whatever, solve this problem. And that helps to cut down fear, because then people always have a place to practice, right? And if they screw it up, they just delete it and then reset it up, right? So that helps. That also helps with one of the other ends, which is the skill thing, because any of the people I know that work on database for a living, if I gave you that problem and I said, you have to do this, they would figure out a way to do it, all right? VB script, PowerShell, Bash, right? Whatever crazy thing you need, they would figure out how to do that. And so getting them to understand that they have those skills becomes really important. It also helps them understand how important tooling is, right? Whether you write it or buy it, super important.
You bring up a good point, right? Because the other thing you mentioned, one of the four things was time, right? Time, right? And so I'm like, hey, take 15 minutes out of the day. You don't have to solve it in a day, but take 15 minutes and go, all right, I'm going to try to solve this one thing, right? Maybe I can't finish it, so I'm going to do it, take 15 minutes, right? And I think it's just a matter of blocking out that time.
Yep.
And, all right, here's my homework assignment, right?
Yeah, because I deal with a lot of customers, and we see a lot of POCs where they try to do this really big thing, and then they struggle, not only because they're just understanding the paradigm. Like the skills are not that high, but the paradigm is hard. Yes. But also because it's so big, everything just takes time, right? It becomes this hard challenge. Whereas I really try hard to get customers, and even our engineers go, scale it down, try something small so that we're comfortable, right? We fail fast. Let's not pick the biggest project. Let's pick the smallest.
Sort of a snackable, right? And I like your example, right? Create an empty database, and move this one table, right? And that's snackable. That's doable because it's this small chunk stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, right. The thing about, like, in software, we don't go to somebody teaching and programming. If you're picking up a new language, let's not build, a microservice app that runs across 2 data stores, right? We go build hello world, right? Add 2 numbers together, build something small and trust it, right? And then you can start to add complexity. And so trying to get people to just, temper down their expectations a little bit and just go, let's tackle something that we think is good for us, right? And of course, then once they have confidence, then I'm like, okay, before you buy though, let's tackle something a little bit bigger so that you have trust in that it works. But it does just take that time, and then I think the last thing really is that trust that it works, right? So when I see something small that isn't important work, then I have confidence that the bigger thing will work.
Yeah, agreed. It's building that foundation and then building that you've now been successful. Yeah. Now, right? Let's build on that success, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, building the tooling and implementing is easy. Like if you bought Redgate, or you were using Microsoft tooling, in a week or 2, we could have that completely set up. Yeah. But in a team of 10, I think it would take 6 months to everybody to have the paradigm shift, have the habit of how we store code and move it, and to trust that it works well, right? The approvals, all that stuff works, and then beyond that, larger teams just take even longer. Like I think most companies, I think it's a year to 18 months. And if you look at those impressive companies that speak at conferences, they'll all tell you it's taken us years to get here. It takes us time
Yeah.
to move this throughout all projects.
But I'm a DBA, my attention span's only that long, right? Or something. Right.
But that's why I'm like, tackle
Right,
it
right.
small, go, let's slowly make changes, right? Because worst case, you know, we could always get the source control thing and then give
Right.
somebody SQL compare and go, okay, you create the script, you run all that stuff manually. That's fine, right? Like I don't want to mess up your life.
Right. Let me ask you this though, because in one of the conversations that you and I had recently was that and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to lead anybody astray, but if I remember right, you said it doesn't matter, because we've talked about automation, right? We want to make this as automated as possible. But if I remember right, you said doesn't matter how much we automate, there's still going to be some level of human interaction in there somewhere. Is that a true statement, or does that really just depend on the scenario and the environment and the pipeline and things like that?
So in my experience, there always is. So there's this continuous delivery thing that people talk about, and then there's continuous deployment. Okay.
Yeah.
Continuous delivery is that we have a pipeline that allows us at any point in time to just release code to production. Okay.
Yeah.
Continuous deployment means that we have that pipeline, but if the automation checks out, right, everything goes green, we automatically deploy.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't have anybody that automatically deploys to databases. Plenty of them do it to web apps and, you know, server apps and other things.
Yeah.
Because if there's a mistake, right, they can deploy a fix, right? Like if I typo something, we can fix the typo and deploy that through. Yeah. But if I make a mistake in a database, it's a whole different thing. So I don't have any customers that trust their testing to the point where they don't have a human at least look at the script and go, yep, that change is not going to break anything.
Okay.
Right? Because innocuous changes could cause index rebuilds. They could do all locking and blocking. They could do things that substantially ruin production availability or performance. Yeah. Right? So I don't have anybody that doesn't have a human somewhere in the process. And if I were the DBA, I would always want somebody that at least have to approve something, because unknown changes could ruin my day. Right. Yeah. You know, they make this ring, right? And I hate when this thing rings, right? Like that's my goal as DBA is I don't want this thing to ring.
Right.
So I think there's always a human involved. And of course, you have to remember too, right? Like adopting DevOps usually means that I don't get to write code, commit it. Somebody else has to code review it, right? This pull request thing. Software developers do it all day long, right? Nobody gets to commit code without somebody else looking at it. Right? Yeah. We have unit tests running, which aren't perfect, but they help, right? We deploy to QA, so we make sure it deploys correctly.
Yeah.
You know, I always recommend that you have something between QA and production where before you deploy, you back up and restore from production, right? Usually just schema, but at least get the schema back so you're sure that if somebody did something in production, like a DBA did a hot fix, we can still deploy this code.
Okay.
Right, because we don't want deployments to fail, right? Like all this is the stuff that we would do manually if we had unlimited time and resources. We would just do this stuff anyway.
Yeah, that's awesome. Quick question. Well, let me remind everybody that's watching before I have my question. Let me remind everybody that's watching. Look, feel free to ask a question. If you got a question for me or Steve, post it in the Q&A and we'll answer your question. This is as much as it is, this is all for you. So please do not hesitate to ask your question and we'll get your questions answered. I guess my follow-up question, Steve, is this, like for myself, we had a client come up and go, hey, we want to implement DevOps, right? Because they were one of these clients that were going right against, right? I'm making changes right to production, and it was in Azure, right?
Right.
I'm like, oh my goodness. So, this was, it's been a long time since I've done any type of DevOps. So if I wanted to get started and go, where do I guess this is where do I go to get started? Where do I go to learn about this stuff? How do I get started? Question.
Yeah. So, the learning is a little bit hard because, I feel like we're still in the wild west of DevOps for databases, right? And it's fragmented. And the tooling is immature, so tool sets matter. The first thing I would really say, right, like for your client, right, their Azure SQL database, I would go, have to create a development environment. So in Azure SQL database, I can back up and restore a database over somewhere, right? And so I have to have a process to do that first, right? Now there's clicks in Azure to do that, but I can't ever replace a database, right? Like I'm always creating a new name, right? Which is a crazy thing, but I need a way to be able to get my developers a place where they can do stuff without making my phone ring, without causing problems, right? Yeah. And then what I would do is say you have to get this stuff in version control, and that requires you to just kind of do some tooling there, right? Yep. Either you pick up SSDT from Microsoft, you pick up something from Redgate, or you pick another vendor and you just go, I need a way for my developers to just capture this code and save it somewhere, okay? Yeah. Because that gives you a lot of power and foundation in having that. To update code, meanwhile, is something like SQL Compare or Schema Compare and SSDT to just go, let me generate a script, let me look at development production and just generate a script that somebody looks at, and they'll manually run it. Like I'm not a fan of publish or any of those crazy things, but just manually generate a script and run it. And that way you can keep working. And then we can slowly go, well, can we automate that process? Can we now introduce a test environment where we deploy those test changes to before we go to production, right? So again, right, baby steps, get it going. That would be the way I tackle that kind of thing. Okay. Honestly, I might just say though, create one table in dev here and let's add a new process for this one table, right? You're not using the application, but let's just get it working. And then slowly, once we're confident there, we'll put other changes through that process.
Okay. Cool. I like that. Yeah, that's the whole baby step thing, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole, just get your feet wet and have a success and then, right, build on that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember when I got, like this company in Azure, right? I got them to sync, we built a kind of a dev environment in Azure and I got it to sync and I'm like, woohoo, success, right? Now I got to do that on-prem and that's becoming more of a challenge, right? So I'm going to do another woohoo once I get that done, but
exactly.
Right, there's some baby steps.
Yeah, it's definitely baby steps.
Yeah, cool. All right, anybody? We've got just a few minutes left. Anybody have any questions? This is all for you. So I've learned, I've learned a lot. This has been, this is kind of the, this is the scenario where I wish I could, schedule Steve for an hour once a week and go, let me pick your brain. Right on the,
well, I'm happy to come back, especially Scott, if we want to dive on like a particular area or somewhere, let's happy to come back at some point in the future. And
that would be awesome. You know what? Because I think, we're recording this, we'll put this out there, but I think this is going to be, this is the 101 level, right? Let's have let's have a 201, right? In a few months, right? Because I think that's for me. I think I'm trudging my way through the 101 stuff, but by that time I'm going to need a 201.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. So, and that's, these are the same types of things as our customers. I think the things I always emphasize is that, as we find things that work, we want to do those more, right? I mean, it's common sense, but sometimes we don't do that. Like we treat too many things as one-off. And then also when we have things that don't work, we have to stop doing them. And I think we all get in the trap of, we've always done it like this. We'll deal with the pain and we'll just keep doing it. But, we want to treat this like next year at this time, I want to have more free time and I want my job to be easier. Right. So if that's my goal, how do I make this better?
How do I make that happen?
Right. Now, forget about my company and my boss, everybody being happy. What about me making my job better?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question too, because Dan posted something, right? And, we're talking about tooling. Let's just wrap up with this question. We're talking about tooling. It's not a one, how do I say this? It's not a one or the other. Can I have a mix of tooling to solve the problem? Like, can I use SSDT and Redgate and whatever to solve my problem?
You absolutely could, right? And that's the thing that is great about DevOps, is you can do whatever. So SSDT is kind of a state-based desired state configuration that you say, this is the model of my database. This is how I want it to work. Right. And now make this other database look like it. And you can use that to kind of store off a project. And then you could use some other tooling that might take the state of that project and deploy it somewhere else. And so a lot of customers I run into have cobbled together different things along the way.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot use SQL Compare from Redgate, but there's similar tools in other places. But they use that in conjunction with some other process that they've done. The same thing now, like Redgate owns Flyway, which is a script runner, for lack of a better term. But there's a lot of companies that have all sorts of processes in dev to gather stuff together and do work, and then they drop it into the script runner and it runs it. So I certainly think, I always tell people, I will show you an approach or a couple of approaches, but I'm not saying this is what you should do. I want you to think about, right, I'm trying to capture code and version control. I'm trying to make it easy for my developers. I'm trying to evaluate whether that code works with other code. I'm trying to test it to make sure it meets my requirements. And I'm trying to make sure that I can reliably and repeatably deploy that to other systems.
Yeah.
How I do those things is up to me.
So, and that goes back to what you were saying, I think at the very beginning, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. Right, your first process should be the thought analysis of what am I, right? And then put that on paper, and then, okay, what tools am I going to use to do that?
Yeah, and like I said, it's quick. It's not a big project. I mean, really, this is grab a few developers, right, and sit down over lunch and go, listen, if our job's dependent on us doing this, how would we do this? How do we get code to production? Now, how do we get the code into that format? Now, how do we test that code? How do we store it, right? Really, it's a lunchtime exercise, and then you start to evaluate a couple of ways of doing it.
Awesome. All right, we are at the top of the hour. Steve, thank you so much. This has been, oh my goodness, been phenomenal, right? This is one of the best 101 discussions I've had in a long time. So thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, and happy to be there. And we'll do it again soon, Scott. Hopefully I see you in person somewhere.
Yeah, let's figure out what conferences you're going. Let's figure out where we're going.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so you're right. All right, Steve, thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for watching. And Steve will definitely have you back for a 201 discussion.
Thanks, Scott. Enjoy your day.
All right, you bet. Thanks, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you in another webinar.